The morning Elena Vasquez turned 38 years old, she woke up on a folding cot inside a 10 by 10 storage unit in Asheville, North Carolina, with her daughter's cold feet pressed against her ribs and a mouse running along the baseboards near the door. The unit smelled like cardboard and old motor oil and the particular kind of damp that settles into places no sun ever reaches. Above her head, in the narrow slice of darkness between stacked boxes of dishes she couldn't sell, and clothes Sofia had already outgrown. A birthday nobody had called about was happening without ceremony. Sofia was 8 years old and still believed in things. She believed the mouse was friendly and had named him Gerald. She believed the storage unit was an adventure, the way children reframe what they cannot change into something they can survive. Signed, she believed her mother when Elena said this was temporary, that a plan existed somewhere just ahead of them, that one morning they would wake up somewhere with a window and a door that locked from the inside instead of the outside. Elena had stopped believing in most things approximately 14 months ago when Marcus walked out of their apartment in Charlotte with a duffel bag and an attitude that suggested the whole marriage had been an imposition on his real life. He left behind the lease, the car payment 3 months behind, a credit card balance shaped like an emergency that never ended, and Sofia, who was 7 then and had cried for 2 weeks straight before she stopped and became the quietly determined child she was now. The child with practical eyes who helped fold blankets with military precision and never asked for things Elena couldn't afford. The storage unit wasn't the plan. The storage unit was what happened when the plan ran out. Elena had grown up in this part of North Carolina, daughter of immigrants who had arrived from Oaxaca with nothing but determination and the address of a cousin in Charlotte who owed them a favor. Her father, Rodrigo Vasquez, had worked construction for 30 years, built half the suburban developments surrounding Charlotte with his hands, and died of a heart attack at 61 before he could sit still long enough to enjoy what he'd built. Her mother, Carmen, had moved back to her sister's house in Guadalajara 3 years ago, her knees giving out, but her English never quite fluent enough for her to feel at home in a country she'd lived in for 4 decades. Elena had inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's tendency to cry at things that were beautiful when she thought nobody was watching. She had 2 siblings. Carlos was 42 and lived in Raleigh in a house with a finished basement, and a wife who posted inspirational quotes on Instagram from a life that required no inspiration because it was already comfortable. Marisol was 44, a dental hygienist in Charlotte with 2 kids in private school and a habit of calling Elena's situation a choice, as though poverty were a lifestyle preference rather than a consequence of cascading disasters Elena had not chosen and could not stop. Neither of them had called on her birthday. What they had done 3 days earlier was call about the letter. The letter had come from an attorney named Howard Peel, whose office was in a small mountain town called Slades Creek in Yancey County, roughly an hour east of Asheville. It was addressed to Elena specifically, not to any of the Vasquez children collectively, and it stated in the careful language of probate law that her maternal grandfather, Miguel Angel Reyes, had died 6 weeks prior at the age of 91, and that per the terms of his final will and testament, he had left to his granddaughter Elena his only property, a tract of mountain land in Yancey County consisting of approximately 67 acres on the upper western slope of a peak locally known as Reyes Ridge. There was no cabin, no structure of any kind, just the land itself and whatever stood on it, which according to the deed was mostly forest, limestone outcroppings, and elevation. Howard Peel's letter noted that the land had been appraised for tax purposes at $18,000, a number so small it barely registered as an asset. When Carlos called after apparently getting word through family channels, he didn't ask how Elena was doing. He didn't mention that it was almost her birthday. He launched immediately into a tone of concerned authority that she recognized from 35 years of being the younger sister everyone assumed needed managing. It's steep mountain land, Elena. You can't farm it, can't build on most of it, can barely get to it, from what I understand. The road up there is a dirt track. What are you going to do with 67 acres of rock and trees? You're living in a storage unit. That's not a stable base from which to manage property. She had not told Carlos about the storage unit. She had told him she was between places. Between places and a storage unit were the same thing in his mind, apparently. And in that assumption, he was not entirely wrong. Marisol's call came 20 minutes after Carlos's, which told Elena they had spoken before calling her, had prepared a position. Marisol's tone was softer, more tactical. The dental hygienist's chairside manner applied to a family transaction. Abuelo was always a little eccentric. You know that. He moved up to those mountains when none of us were even born yet, and barely came down. We barely knew him. You only met him, what, 3 times? For him to leave you everything specifically, honestly, it seems like he might not have been thinking clearly at the end. So there are ways to contest these things if you need to. But the easiest thing, the thing that makes the most sense, is if you just let Carlos handle the sale. The land's worth almost nothing, but even nothing split 3 ways is better than nothing alone. You need cash right now, not a mountain. Elena had said she would think about it. She thought about it lying on the cot in the storage unit, while Sofia slept, and Gerald the mouse rustled somewhere near the boxes. She thought about how $6,000 minus whatever taxes and fees would be almost nothing. Would buy them 2 months maybe. Would solve nothing. Would dissolve like all the other temporary solutions she'd found over the past year into the bottomless need for the next thing. She thought about her grandfather, whom she had met 3 times and remembered as a man of very few words and very careful eyes, the kind of eyes that saw more than they said. She thought about the fact that he had left the land to her, not to all 3 of them, not to Carlos, who managed things, not to Marisol, who was sensible, to her. Elena, the one sleeping in a storage unit, the one who had failed in every way a person could quantify failure. She didn't know what to make of that, but she knew that it meant something. In the morning, she sat up on the cot and looked at Sofia, who was awake and already drawing in her notebook, her small, dark head bent over the page with total concentration. Sofia drew the same thing repeatedly, variations on a theme. A house. Always a house, usually with mountains behind it, sometimes with animals in the yard, always with 2 figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small, their hands connected by a line that represented holding on. Mom. Sofia said it quietly, the way she said most things. We're going to Abuelo's mountain, aren't we? Elena looked at her daughter, this small, practical person who had survived the past year with more grace than Elena had managed herself. How do you know? Because you've been lying awake thinking. And when you do that all night, it means something's happening. Sofia went back to her drawing. And I think mountains would be better than here. There was nothing to argue with in that. There was very little to argue with in anything Sofia said. The child had a gift for reducing things to their essential truth in a way that made argument feel beside the point. They packed what they owned, which took 2 hours, loaded it into the 2014 Honda Accord that had 200,000 miles on it, and a dashboard light that had been indicating some vague engine concern for the past 6 months without any actual engine failure materializing, as though the car were making the same bluff Elena was making every day, and drove out of the storage facility in the early morning light, with everything they had and nowhere else to be. The drive to Slade's Creek took just over an hour. The road climbed into the mountains almost immediately after leaving Asheville. the landscape shifting from highway sprawl to the dense, ancient green of the southern Appalachians, in a way that always hit Elena somewhere in the chest, a physical sensation, something her body recognized even when her mind was too busy worrying to pay attention. These were old mountains, the oldest in North America, older than the Rockies or the Alps or the Himalayas, worn smooth by time into shapes that looked like patience, rolling and forested, and somehow both vast and intimate, green in the summer to a degree that seemed impossible, layered ridge behind ridge, in gradients of blue and gray that disappeared into the distance like an illustration of infinity. Sofia pressed her face against the window and breathed fog onto the glass. "I think I can see it," she said. "What?" "Our mountain. All the mountains are ours, baby. None of them. You can't own a mountain." Sofia considered this. Abuelo owned one. Elena didn't have a response to that. Howard Peel's office was on the main street of Slade's Creek, a town small enough that the main street was also the only street, flanked by a hardware store, a diner, like a post office that seemed to operate on part-time hours, and a church whose marquee sign offered weekly theological observations in the cheerful Southern tradition. The attorney himself was in his 60s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with silver hair and a careful handshake that told Elena he was used to delivering news to people in difficult circumstances and had learned to do it with gentleness. He brought them coffee and a juice box for Sofia without being asked, which elevated him immediately in Elena's estimation, and spread the relevant documents across his desk with the organized efficiency of someone who had prepared for this meeting. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions," he said. "He was very clear that this land was to go to you personally, that the deed was not to be transferred to any other family member or sold by proxy, and that you were to come here yourself to complete the transfer. He was explicit about that. He wanted you to come." "Did you know him well?" Elena asked. Peel paused in a way that suggested the question required honesty rather than the easy professional answer. He was a client for about 12 years. He was a private man. He came in every few years to update his documents, always alone, never talked about himself beyond what was necessary for the legal work. But I'll tell you something. He talked about you. Not often, but when the subject of family came up, he mentioned you specifically. Said you were the one who still had her father's spirit, that you hadn't learned to give up yet, even when it looked like you had. Elena's throat tightened. She looked at Sofia, who was examining a snow globe on Peel's bookshelf with the focused attention of a scientist. "He barely knew me," Elena said. "We met 3 times. Peel nodded slowly. He knew more than that. He was watching. Not in a strange way, just he paid attention to people. From a distance. He said once that the people who don't ask for anything are the ones who deserve something." He smiled briefly, the lines around his eyes deepening. I thought that was a very old-fashioned thing to say, but he believed it. She signed the papers where Peel indicated, her hand steadier than she expected. The deed transferred cleanly. 67 acres. Reyes Ridge, Yancey County. No liens, no debts, no encumbrances. The land was hers. Peel provided a hand-drawn map from what appeared to be a much older original. The lines faded and retraced in ballpoint pen, and a key that opened a gate at the foot of the access track. He also provided a metal box he'd been holding in trust, which Miguel had left along with the deed documents. Small, painted dark green. Locked. "The key for this one is in the box itself," Peel said, which had been Peel's own private puzzle for years, until he realized the lock was more ceremonial than functional, and the key was taped to the inside of the lid. "Your grandfather had a sense of humor. Very dry. You have no idea what's in it. He told me it was private correspondence and maps. That's all I know." Elena put the box in her bag without opening it. Some things should be opened in the right place. The access track to Reyes Ridge began as a gravel road off the county highway. Gravel giving way to packed dirt after about a mile. Dirt narrowing to a single lane that climbed the mountainside through a forest, so dense the canopy closed overhead like a tunnel. The Honda handled it with the grudging effort of a car, doing something it had not been designed for, but would accommodate under protest. Sofia tracked their progress on the hand-drawn map, with the seriousness of a navigator on a significant expedition. "We should be coming to a creek crossing soon," she announced. The creek appeared right where the map suggested it would, a stone ford maybe 18 inches deep at the most, the water so clear Elena could see every individual pebble on the bottom. She crossed it slowly, the Honda splashing through, and on the other side the track curved sharply upward, and the trees gave way just enough to reveal the slope above them. And there it was. Not a cabin, not a structure of any kind. Just land, raw and old, and steeply rising, forested on the lower slopes with hardwoods that would be spectacular in October, the upper reaches going to pine and rhododendron, and then to bare limestone outcroppings near what appeared to be the summit, pale gray rock jutting from the green like exposed bone. It was rough country, steep and rocky, and not obviously useful for anything. From the outside, from the valley, from anywhere that wasn't standing here on this track looking up at it, Elena could understand precisely why Carlos had called it worthless. Standing here looking up at it, she understood something else entirely, on something she couldn't have explained and didn't try to. It was hers. Her grandfather had stood on this same track at some point in his life and looked at this same slope and decided it was worth keeping, worth protecting, worth leaving to someone he trusted with it. And there was an intimacy in that, a kind of conversation conducted across time without words, that made her chest ache in the way that beautiful things sometimes did. Sofia had gotten out of the car without being asked and was standing in the track with her hands on her hips and her head tilted back, looking up at the mountain with an expression Elena recognized because it was the same one she'd seen in the mirror for the past 20 minutes. "It's ours," Sofia said. "It's ours," Elena agreed. The track continued upward another quarter-mile to a small, flat clearing near the 800-foot level where the land opened up enough to park a car and see the valley below. The valley was wide and lush, the Yangtze River visible as a silver thread through the farmland below, small houses and church steeples, and the water tower for the town of Ridgeton marking the valley floor. It was beautiful down there. It was also, Elena noted, without knowing yet why she noted it, considerably lower than where she was standing. The clearing had a fire ring of stacked stones, blackened from many years of use, and a wooden platform that had once supported a tent or some kind of structure. The boards weathered silver but still sound when she pressed on them. Around the clearing, the trees were old, massive hardwoods whose canopies interlocked 40 feet above her head, and among them were several large boulders of limestone, so pale they almost glowed in the late morning light. Elena opened the green metal box sitting on the hood of the Honda. Inside was exactly what Peel had described, papers and maps, but also a letter in an envelope addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. The letters careful and slightly formal, in the way of someone who had learned to write English as an adult, and always wrote it with a precision that native speakers never bothered with. The envelope said, simply, "For Elena." In Spanish, he had added beneath the English, "Para cuando llegues," for when you arrive. She made Sofia a peanut butter sandwich from the food they'd packed and sat on the wooden platform with the letter in her hands, while her daughter explored the clearing with the systematic attention she applied to new environments, cataloging, examining, forming theories. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a mixture of Spanish and English that shifted without apology between languages, the way very old people sometimes did, when they'd spent a life thinking in two directions at once. Elena translated the Spanish parts in her head as she read, her own Spanish rusty from disuse, her father's first language that she'd grown up hearing but never practiced enough to feel fluent in. Mi Elena, her grandfather had written, and the use of her name with the possessive, the quiet claim of it, the my, not made her have to stop and breathe for a moment before she could continue. Mi Elena. I am writing this in November, which is my favorite month on the mountain. The leaves are gone, and the ridge is visible, and the air has a quality that is hard to describe in any language I know, but that I will try to describe by saying it feels like clarity, like the air itself is thinking clearly. I am writing this knowing I will not be here when you read it, and knowing also that you will come. I have watched you from a distance for many years, and I know you have your father's quality of not giving up on things that matter. You have been through hard times recently. I know this. I know also that hard times are not evidence of failure, whatever people around you might suggest. They are evidence of having tried. I want to tell you about this land. I came to these mountains in 1971, which is 53 years ago as I write this, though I imagine you are reading it somewhat later than that. I was 40 years old, and I came here because I needed to be somewhere that did not require me to explain myself, and because I had found something on this ridge that I believed was worth guarding. I will not explain everything in this letter, because some things should be understood in the place they belong to, not on paper, away from that place. But I want you to know that this land is not what it appears to be from the road. The mountain keeps things. Old mountains always do. This one has kept something for a very long time, and it has been waiting for the right circumstances to reveal it. I believe you may be the person here when those circumstances arrive, though I cannot be certain. Nature works on its own schedule, not ours. There are maps in this box. Study them. Learn the land before you judge it. The most important features are not visible in summer. In certain conditions, particularly after heavy rain or when the water table rises, things become apparent on this ridge that are not apparent otherwise. I have marked the relevant areas with red ink. Pay attention to the lower limestone fields, the area I have labeled the shelf, and the northwest face where the rock is youngest and most prone to movement. Do not let anyone tell you this land is worthless. People call things worthless when they cannot immediately see a use for them. Value and use are different things, and patient people have always understood this better than impatient ones. Your grandfather loves you very much, even though he was not skilled at showing it in person. I watched you grow up through photographs your father sent, and through the things people said about you at family gatherings I attended from the corners of rooms. You were always the one who gave things away. Food, help, time, money you could not spare. That quality will either destroy you or save you, and I believe it will save you, because the people who give without expectation are the ones the universe eventually decides to be generous with in return. Take care of the mountain. It will take care of you. Your grandfather, Miguel. P.S. There is a spring on the northwest face that produces the best water I have ever tasted in my life. It comes up from the limestone very cold and very clean, and it never fails, even in droughts when the valley below goes dry. Remember this: springs that never fail are rarer than gold. Elena sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The clearing was quiet around her. Sofia had found something interesting near one of the large limestone boulders and was examining it with a stick. The valley spread out below them in the midday light, blue and green and peaceful, the Yangtze River catching the sun in intermittent flashes. She read the letter twice more, and then she folded it carefully and put it back in the green box, and she looked at the maps. There were 4 of them, hand-drawn on heavy paper, in the precise manner of someone who had once been trained to make maps, or at least to read them carefully. The first was a broad survey of the 67 acres, showing the property boundaries, the access track, the creek crossing, the clearing where she now sat, and a dozen features marked with abbreviations she didn't yet understand. The second was a closer view of what her grandfather had labeled the shelf, a flat area approximately 200 yards across on the upper portion of the mountain, marked with red ink circles in 3 places. The third showed the northwest face of the ridge in detail, the limestone outcroppings individually numbered, several of them connected by dotted lines that suggested passages or channels of some kind. The fourth was different from the others, older looking, possibly a copy of something even older, showing the same ridge from a geological perspective, with handwritten notes in the margins that referenced mineral formations, water tables, and cavern systems. Cavern systems. Elena looked at the word written in her grandfather's careful handwriting and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was looking at. Not rock and trees, and something underneath. She folded the maps back into the box and looked at Sofia. "We're going to need to explore," she said. Sofia's face did the thing it did when something good was happening, the slow, careful smile that started at her eyes. "I know. I already found something." She led Elena to the large limestone boulder she'd been examining, a pale gray mass roughly 12 feet high that had either fallen from above or pushed up from below at some point in the geological past, settling at an angle that created a natural overhang on its north face. Under the overhang, protected from rain and direct sun, were faint markings on the rock. Not natural markings. Deliberate ones, made with something red, possibly paint, possibly a mineral pigment of some kind. Arrows. 2 of them, pointing upward and to the northwest. "He was here," Sofia said simply. "He put those there." Elena crouched and looked at the markings. They were old, but not ancient. Maybe decades rather than centuries. The kind of age that fit with a man who had come to this mountain in 1971 and spent 50 years learning its secrets. "He was here," she agreed. They spent the rest of that first day doing what her grandfather had instructed and what common sense demanded, learning the land. Elena had grown up in a city, and her relationship with the natural world was conceptual rather than practical, the kind of appreciation you had for things viewed through windows rather than touched with your hands. But the maps were clear enough to follow, and the mountain itself had a logic she found herself beginning to understand. The way water moved along it, always following the limestone, always finding the path of least resistance downward toward the valley. The way the trees changed with elevation. The way the air changed, too. Cooler and sharper as you climbed. And the particular quality her grandfather had mentioned. That sense of clarity, of thinking clearly. She located the spring on the northwest face late in the afternoon. It came up from between 2 limestone slabs in a flow so steady and quiet, it seemed less like water emerging from the ground and more like the ground breathing. She cupped her hands and drank and understood immediately what her grandfather meant. Cold to a degree that was almost shocking, or clean in a way that tasted like nothing at all, like the idea of clean water before any other water had ever disappointed you. Sofia drank too, and made a sound of pure pleasure that Elena hadn't heard from her in months. It was getting toward evening when Elena realized they had nowhere to sleep. This had been a fact the whole day, but she had successfully avoided confronting it until the light began changing and the shadows lengthened, and the valley below them went gold with late sun. They had a tent, a 2-person backpacking tent she'd bought at a thrift store in Asheville 6 months ago for exactly this kind of contingency, and a sleeping bag and blankets, and the wooden platform in the clearing was level and dry. It was September. The nights would be cool, but not dangerous. They ate from the food in the cooler, see peanut butter again, and apples and crackers, and set up the tent in the clearing while the last light faded from the valley below and the first stars appeared over the ridge. The night sounds were different from anything Elena had heard in a long time. No traffic, no parking lot lights, no distant sirens. Crickets and owls and the wind moving through the trees with a sound like breathing. And underneath all of it, so faint, she had to hold her breath to hear it, the sound of the spring coming up from the limestone on the northwest face, steady and quiet and tireless. Sofia fell asleep before it was fully dark. Elena lay in the tent with her daughter's warmth against her side and looked through the mesh ceiling at more stars than she'd seen in years, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, and was almost afraid to name, because she had learned that naming things too early jinxed them. But it was there, solid and quiet, the same quality as the spring, the same steadiness. She slept better than she had in 14 months. Carlos called in the morning while she was heating water on the camp stove for instant coffee, and Sofia was refilling their water bottles at the spring, a task she had appointed herself with proprietary care. "So you went." Carlos's voice had the tone of a parent who had expected disobedience and was now managing his disappointment with professional distance. "Elena, you understand this isn't practical. No, you're camping on a mountain with a 9-year-old. That's not a living situation. We're here to understand what Abuelo left us. He left you 67 acres of steep terrain that the county values at $18,000. He didn't leave you a house or a road or anything useful. He left you a problem. He specifically left it to me, not to us." She could hear the shift in his breathing, the particular adjustment Carlos made when he was recalibrating from persuasion to something harder. "Look, I've already talked to a real estate agent in that area. There are timber companies that buy land like this for the wood value. We could be looking at 25, maybe 30,000 after fees if we move quickly. Split 3 ways, that's 10,000 each. You need $10,000, Elena. You're living out of a car. This would actually help you. What you're doing right now, camping on a mountain to honor some sentimental attachment to a grandfather you barely knew, that's not helping you." "He died and left it to me," Elena said slowly. "And not to you, and not to Marisol, specifically to me. Don't you think that means something? It means he was an old man who was slightly eccentric and didn't think things through. Or it means he thought things through more carefully than any of us and had a reason for what he did." Carlos made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Elena, I'm trying to help you. You have no income, no housing, a child who should be in school. This isn't the time for a sentimental expedition into the mountains. I'll let you know what I find." She hung up before he could respond, which she recognized was the kind of decision you make when you have run out of patience for the version of yourself other people insist on seeing, the failure, the problem, the one who needs managing. Her grandfather had seen something different. She intended to find out what. The second day on the mountain, Elena began systematically following the maps. She had borrowed a measuring tape and a compass from the hardware store in Slades Creek on their way through, paying for them with the last of the cash in her wallet. And she walked the shelf, the flat area 200 yards across on the upper mountain that her grandfather had marked with red ink circles. The shelf was striking once she was standing on it, a geological feature so distinct it seemed almost deliberate. So a broad plateau of exposed limestone, sitting at roughly the 1,300-foot level like a natural stage. The limestone here was pale and pitted, worn into unusual formations by centuries of water moving through it. Small depressions and ridges that formed patterns. And in 3 places, the rock had a different quality. Darker, slightly recessed, as though the ground beneath were hollow. She put her ear to the rock in one of these places and heard, very faintly, the sound of water. Not surface water. Water moving somewhere underneath. The maps made more sense with her feet on the ground. The dotted lines on the geological map weren't arbitrary. They followed the limestone formations she could see around her, marked what appeared to be the edges of a system of some kind, saw a network of cavities or passages that the water was using as a highway through the mountain. She had no way to know how large or how deep. The maps showed their extent, but not their scale. On the third day, Marisol called. "I hear you're still up there." Marisol's voice had the gentle relentlessness of someone who believed they were acting in your best interest and could sustain that belief against any evidence to the contrary. "Sofia hasn't been to school in 3 days. I'm registering her in the county school on Monday. Elena, you can't homeschool a 9-year-old on a mountainside. I'm not homeschooling her. I said I'm registering her. I found out there's a school bus that comes up the county road." A pause. "You're planning to stay." "I'm planning to understand what Abuelo left me before I make any decisions." Marisol's tone shifted to the other register, the one that sounded like concern but carried underneath it the faint vibration of judgment. "Look, I know you're going through something. I know the divorce was hard, and things have been very difficult, and I'm not criticizing you for that. But you have to think about what's practical for Sofia. She needs stability. She needs consistency. She needs a real home, not an adventure that ends when it gets cold." "She needs a mother who hasn't given up," Elena said. "That's what she needs first." There was a silence on the line that had a specific texture, the texture of a sibling recognizing they have pushed against something solid and encountered resistance where they expected to find nothing. "If you need money," Marisol said finally, "there are ways to get money from this without camping on the mountain." "I'll be in touch," Elena said. She spent the rest of that day with the geological map and a long stick she was using to probe the limestone depressions on the shelf. The third depression, the one farthest to the northwest, was different from the others. The rock around it was fractured along what appeared to be natural fault lines, and when she pressed the stick into the deepest crack she could find along the edge, it went down farther than the length of the stick. She found a longer stick. That one went down farther still. Something was down there. The question was what? She didn't try to open it. Not yet. The limestone was old and fragile, and the wrong pressure in the wrong place could collapse whatever lay beneath. And her grandfather's letter had said that certain conditions were required, that heavy rain and rising water tables made things apparent that weren't apparent otherwise. She was here in September, the end of the dry season. The wet season would come. She was willing to wait. What she wasn't willing to do was leave. That realization settled over her on the 4th evening as she sat on the wooden platform, with the maps spread across her lap and the valley below her glowing in the last light. This was hers. Not as a transaction, not as an asset to liquidate, but as a place. The mountain had a quality she had felt from the first moment she looked up at it from the access track, a solidity, a permanence, a quality of enduring. Everything else in her life for the past 14 months had been temporary, contingent, dependent on circumstances that could change without warning, and had. The storage unit could be reclaimed. The car could break down. The next plan could fail like the last plan. But 67 acres of mountain in Yancey County belonged to her as absolutely as anything in her life had ever belonged to her. And she was standing on it. And her daughter was right here. And the spring on the northwest face was coming up cold and clean from the limestone, and had been doing so without interruption for longer than any of them had been alive. Sofia brought her a cup of spring water without being asked, and sat beside her on the platform and looked at the valley. "The houses down there are pretty at night," Sofia said. "The lights." "They are." Sofia was quiet for a moment. drawing something in her notebook by the fading light. Then she said, "Do you think Abuelo knew what was going to happen? That we'd end up needing this? I think he knew enough." Elena looked at the map in her hands, the red ink circles, the dotted lines, the careful handwriting in the margins. "I think he watched people and understood things, and he decided we were the kind of people who would come up here and actually try to understand what he left us instead of selling it." Sofia nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already concluded. "Good thing he picked us then." "Good thing," Elena agreed. The school registration on Monday turned out to be simpler than Elena had feared. The Yancey County schools had seen unusual family situations before, had no strong objection to a 9-year-old enrolling mid-September with an address that was technically a clearing on a mountain, and the principal, a woman named Diane Sorrells, with short gray hair and 30 years of Appalachian school administration behind her, looked at Sofia's records from Charlotte, and then looked at Sofia and said simply, "She's clearly not been neglected educationally, and that's half the battle." The bus would stop at the county road below the access track every morning at 7:15. Sofia would need to walk down and back, a third of a mile each way. This was, Sofia observed, with the pragmatism she had applied to every inconvenience of the past year, not a problem. She had good boots. What Elena needed, beyond a plan for winter, beyond answers to what lay beneath the limestone shelf, was income. She put together a short list in the notebook she'd started keeping since arriving on the mountain, in the organized way she'd had to develop just to maintain the illusion of control over a life that had slipped its moorings. She had a nursing degree she'd stopped using when Sofia was born, and Marcus's income had seemed sufficient to support them. She had a year of experience as an office manager before the recession that had ended that job. She had, more usefully, 2 months of emergency medical training and a first aid certification she could update. The county hospital in Burnsville was 40 minutes away and was hiring, according to their website, for nursing positions at every level. She applied that Monday evening from the parking lot of the library in Slades Creek, using their Wi-Fi, with the mountain at her back and the town spread out below her. The application went through at 10:47 p.m. She drove back up the mountain in the dark, crossed the creek ford by the light of her headlamps, and sat for a while in the clearing before going into the tent, looking at the valley below. The lights of Ridgeton and the smaller communities in the Yancey River Valley were laid out below her in a familiar pattern she was beginning to recognize. The particular geography of the valley, the way it curved along the river's path, how the ridge lines contained it on both sides. She was noticing things about this valley she hadn't noticed before, the way it sat in its topography, cupped between the ridges, low along its center where the river ran, and lower still at the valley's eastern end, where the river eventually met the larger watershed. She was a nurse, and nurses noticed things. They noticed shapes. They noticed when something that should be in balance wasn't in balance, when pressure was accumulating somewhere, when a system was under more strain than it appeared from the outside. She noticed these things about patients, and she was beginning to notice them about landscapes too, though she could not yet say what she was noticing, or why it made her feel watchful in the same way that a patient's color made her watchful, that particular alertness that preceded understanding. She went to sleep watching the valley lights and woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of rain. It had been forecast. A slow-moving system coming in from the southwest, warm and wet, the kind of rain that could last for days in the mountains, the kind that saturated the soil and filled the creeks and raised the water table. And she lay in the tent listening to it on the canvas and thought about her grandfather's letter. Things become apparent in certain conditions. After heavy rain, when the water table rises. The rain fell for 2 days. It was on the morning of the 3rd day, when the sky had cleared to a tender September blue, and the light had that washed quality that comes after rain, has cleaned the air of everything that wasn't necessary, that Sofia came running across the clearing from the direction of the limestone shelf with an expression on her face that Elena had never seen before. Not fear, not excitement in the ordinary sense. Something more like the look people have when they have witnessed, something that rearranges their understanding of what is possible. "Mom," her voice was different, lower, the voice of someone trying not to startle something. "Mom, you need to come right now." The rock opened. Elena came. The shelf had changed overnight. She saw it from 20 yards away, the long fracture that had appeared along the northeast edge of the largest depression, a crack wide enough to put her hand into running for 6 or 7 feet, through the limestone in a line so straight it seemed almost deliberate. The rock on either side of the fracture had subsided slightly, tilted inward by an inch or two, as though whatever had been holding it in tension from below had relaxed or shifted, allowing gravity to have its way. She approached carefully, testing each step on the wet rock, and knelt at the edge of the fracture and looked in. She could see nothing. The crack was too narrow, and the angle was wrong, and the depth was indeterminate in the shadows. But from somewhere below, she could feel air moving upward through the crack, cool and steady, and carrying with it a smell she had no frame of reference for immediately, and then slowly identified as mineral, limestone, the deep, clean smell of the underground, a smell that had nothing human in it, and was all the more extraordinary for that. And underneath the mineral smell, something else, a particular quality to the air that she would spend the next weeks trying to describe to various people with various levels of success. She told the hospital's chief of medicine it smelled like clean money, which made him laugh. She told Sofia it smelled like something very old that had been keeping a secret, which Sofia understood immediately. She told Peel when she called him that afternoon that the limestone shelf on her grandfather's property had opened overnight after the rain, that there appeared to be a significant void beneath it, and that she was calling because her grandfather's letter had indicated this was possible, and she needed to understand what her rights were regarding whatever might be found below. Peel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather mentioned a possibility of this nature to me once. He told me the geology up there was unusual, that there were formations suggesting extensive cave development below the surface. He said he'd seen evidence of it when the water table was high, but that access wasn't possible until conditions were right. He said, Miss Vasquez, that he had been waiting for those conditions for 50 years. He was waiting, Elena said. He was patient, Peel said, and he was the most patient man I ever met. Elena stood on the limestone shelf above the crack and looked out over the valley in the September light. The Yangtze River was running high from the rain, silver and fat in its channel below. The valley was green and domestic and ordinary in the way that valleys were, full of people going about their days without knowing what was happening 1,200 feet above them on the old limestone ridge that their grandfathers had always called Reyes Ridge, the ridge belonging to the old Mexican who lived alone up there and never came down, the worthless steep land that nobody had ever found a use for. She put her hand over the fracture and felt the air moving against her palm, cool and steady, coming from somewhere deep. So she thought about her grandfather walking this shelf 50 years ago with his maps and his patience, marking the limestone depressions with his red ink circles, waiting for the conditions that would open what the mountain had been keeping. She thought about him watching her from a distance at weddings and funerals, seeing her father's quality in her, deciding she was the one. She thought about the spring on the northwest face that never failed even in droughts when the valley went dry, and the phrase that had been circling in her mind since she read it in his letter, cold and steady, the best water in the world, springs that never fail, are rarer than gold. The fracture in the limestone was 3 inches wide and ran 6 feet along the shelf. In 2 days, maybe 3, with the water table still elevated from the rain, she would know what was below it. And then she would know whether her grandfather's patience had been answered, whether his 50 years of watching and waiting on this mountain had been a man keeping vigil over something real, or a very old, very private man's way of turning his chosen solitude into meaning. She didn't know yet which it was, but she was beginning to have a feeling. Behind her, Sofia was already drawing it in her notebook, the crack in the rock, the light coming through the cleared sky, the valley below. She had titled the drawing at the top of the page in her careful printing. She'd written, "The day the mountain started talking." Elena looked at her daughter's drawing over her shoulder and felt something she recognized now as the particular texture of hope when it is no longer entirely theoretical. Not the fragile, apologetic hope of the storage unit, the hope that required constant maintenance against the evidence, something older and more grounded. The hope of someone standing on solid rock above a valley in possession of land no one else wanted, waiting on a mountain that had been keeping its secret for longer than any of them had been alive and had just begun, in the rain-cleared September morning, to speak. The crack in the limestone widened by another inch overnight. Elena measured it each morning the way a doctor measures a wound, precisely and without sentiment, recording the numbers in her notebook with the date and the weather and the current level of the creek at the ford below. The creek had risen 2 feet in the rain and was coming down slowly, the mountain releasing its stored water at the pace the limestone permitted, which was unhurried and thorough. She had read enough in the Slades Creek Library's geology section to understand something of what was happening beneath her feet, how the water moved through karst systems, how it dissolved the limestone over centuries and millennia to create void spaces, how the surface above those voids could remain stable for years, or decades, or longer, until some change in pressure, some shift in the water table, some subtle rearrangement of the subterranean architecture tipped the balance, and the ground expressed what it had been holding. The shelf had been holding something. It was now deciding, slowly, that the time for holding was over. On the 4th morning after the rain, when she drove Sofia down to the county road at 6:50 for the school bus, and came back up the mountain to find the crack had opened to nearly 5 inches in the night. The rock on either side had tilted further inward, and the fracture had extended another 2 feet to the south, running now for almost 9 feet along the shelf. Where it was widest, she could look down into the crack with a flashlight and see the first 6 or 7 feet of a limestone wall, pale and wet, dropping away into a darkness that her flashlight could not resolve. She called Howard Peel from the clearing. "The crack is almost 5 inches now," she told him. "I can see wall below it. I think there's a significant space down there." Peel was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned, meant he was organizing his thoughts. "Has it opened in a way that allows entry?" "Not yet. The crack's still too narrow. But the rock is moving. I think it's going to open further." "You need a geologist up there before you do anything else," he said. "I know someone in Asheville who does karst surveys. Good woman, honest. She won't talk about what she finds until you tell her she can. Is she expensive? Her day rate is $400. Elena looked at her notebook. Her account balance was $112. The hospital in Burnsville had called the previous afternoon about her application, and she had a phone interview scheduled for the following week, but that was still the following week. "There's a way to handle this," Peel said, reading the silence correctly. "I can advance the fee against the property value. You repay it from whatever transaction eventually results from this. That's common practice in probate work. I'm not going to be in debt to you. It's not debt. It's a contingency. If nothing comes of this, you owe me nothing." He paused. Your grandfather was a client for 12 years, Miss Vasquez. I'd like to see this end well." She said yes. The geologist arrived 2 days later in a pickup truck, fitted with the equipment of someone who spent significant portions of her life underground. Her name was Carla Whitfield, and she was 53 years old, lean and deliberate in her movements, with the particular tan of someone who worked outdoors, but always in the shade. She spent 2 hours on the shelf before she said anything substantive, and what she said then was directed mostly at the rock itself, a running commentary in technical language that Elena caught fragments of but could not fully follow. What she could follow was Whitfield's posture, the way her body changed as she moved from the outer edges of the shelf to its center and then to the fracture itself. The increasing stillness of her, the focused quality of her attention, the deliberateness with which she touched the rock, pressed her ear to it, used a small hammer to tap in 3 places, and listened to the sound it made. These were the behaviors of someone whose instrument was working and registering something significant. Whitfield crouched at the widest point of the fracture for a long time without speaking. Then she said, without looking up, "How long has your family owned this land?" "My grandfather bought it in 1971. "And before that, it was held by the county." "Before that, I don't know." Whitfield straightened up and turned to look at Elena with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not the expression of someone delivering good news or bad news. It was the expression of someone who was about to say something they were choosing their words for very carefully. "You understand I'm a geologist," she said. "I can tell you about the formation below this shelf. I can tell you its approximate extent and its geological character. I can't tell you what's in it, if anything is in it, or what that would be worth. That's not my field. I understand." With that said, Whitfield looked back at the fracture. "What I'm looking at here is the surface expression of a significant karst void, a cave system, to use the plain language. The formation below this shelf extends, based on the tapping surveys and what I can see of the wall through this crack, to a minimum depth of 40 feet and a lateral extent of somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 square feet, possibly larger. Karst systems like this often connect to other voids, and this ridge sits on a formation that I've seen similar expressions of elsewhere in Yancey County and Mitchell County to the east. The pattern suggests a major system." Elena's pulse had slowed to a careful, deliberate rhythm, the rhythm she used when a patient was telling her something important, and she needed to receive all of it clearly. "Is this unusual? For this area? Major systems are uncommon. Minor cavities are everywhere in karst country. What you have here is not a minor cavity." She paused. "I want to say something else." She looked at Elena directly. "The limestone on this formation has specific properties. It's a variety called Blue Ridge carbonate. Very old, very dense, laid down in the Cambrian. It has a particular mineral profile that, in this part of the Appalachians, is sometimes associated with secondary mineralization. Meaning that in certain geological conditions, fluids moving through this kind of limestone over a very long period of time can deposit minerals. Calcite is the most common, but in formations like this one, where the structural conditions are right, you can also see deposits of other minerals. Barite, fluorite." He paused again. "Occasionally selenite. In exceptional cases, in truly exceptional cases, formations of a size and quality that have no commercial parallel anywhere." Elena was very still. "What kind of quality?" she asked quietly. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. "I'm a geologist, not an appraiser. I'm telling you what the conditions are that would allow certain things to form. I'm not telling you those things are there. But the conditions are right. The conditions," Whitfield said carefully, "are among the most favorable I have ever personally encountered in 40 years of karst survey work, in the southern Appalachians. They stood on the shelf in the clear September morning, with the valley below them, going about its ordinary business. And Elena thought about her grandfather, coming to this mountain in 1971, with his maps and his patience and his knowledge that she still couldn't fully account for, a knowledge that had led him here specifically and kept him here for 50 years, tending this land, guarding this ridge, while waiting for the conditions that would open what lay beneath. He had known, not everything, but enough to believe it was worth a life of watching. Whitfield was back the following Saturday with additional equipment and what she described as a colleague who specialized in secondary mineralization assessment. She did not name the colleague, and Elena did not ask. The two of them spent most of the day on the shelf with instruments Elena did not recognize, and in the late afternoon, Whitfield came to where Elena was sitting on the wooden platform with her coffee and her notebook, and sat down beside her without preamble. The fracture is going to open naturally within the next 2 to 3 weeks if the water table stays elevated. I'd recommend you not try to force it. A karst limestone is fragile at fracture edges, and you can compromise the structural integrity of the void ceiling if you apply pressure in the wrong place. Let the mountain do what it's doing. How long has this been forming down there? Whitfield looked at the valley for a moment. The mineralization process in a formation like this takes time that's difficult to conceptualize. The initial void creation happened over millions of years. Secondary mineralization would have been ongoing for hundreds of thousands of years at a minimum. What's down there has been building since before there were people on this continent. Elena absorbed this, and my grandfather knew about it. He knew the conditions were right. Whether he knew the extent of what was there, I can't say. She paused. He would have needed to get inside to know that. And in 50 years, with the water table fluctuations in this area, I'm not sure the conditions for access were ever quite right. Until now. Sofia had started calling it the opening, speaking of it the way you speak of something that already exists, but hasn't yet been seen, the thing below the shelf that was taking its time becoming visible. Each afternoon when the bus dropped her at the county road, she would walk up the track and go directly to the shelf to check on the crack before she went to the tent. She measured it with a ruler now. She recorded the numbers in her own notebook, a parallel record to Elena's, the two of them documenting the same event from their different heights and perspectives. On the 12th day after the initial fracture, the shelf made a sound. Elena heard it from the clearing, a low grinding rumble that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then stopped. She was at the shelf in less than a minute. The crack had opened to 11 inches at its widest point, and in 3 places along its length, the rock had shifted in a way that changed its character. No longer a crack, but the beginning of a gap, a threshold. She lay down at the widest point and looked in with her flashlight, and for the first time could see more than wall. She could see a floor. It was 15 feet below the surface, pale limestone worn smooth by water, glistening with moisture, a floor that extended into the flashlight's reach and beyond it into the dark. The space it belonged to was too large to see from here, but the ceiling height, calculated from what she could see of the wall, was at least 10 feet, possibly more. She called Whitfield. "I heard it from the clearing," she said. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "What does it look like?" "I can see the floor. The gap is almost a foot wide in places. There's a real space down there. Don't go in." Whitfield's voice was professional and firm. "Not until the fracture has fully stabilized. The rock at the edges is under stress. You wait another week. Give the mountain time to settle into its new configuration." She waited. It was during that week of waiting that her siblings found out about the geologist. She didn't know how. Small-town information traveled in patterns she hadn't yet learned to read, and Slade's Creek was a small town, and Whitfield's truck, parked twice at the base of the access track, was visible from the county road, and someone had apparently connected Elena Vasquez to the property deed filed at the county office and mentioned it to someone who knew Carlos. Carlos called on a Thursday evening. His opening sentence was, "I've been hearing things." She let him talk. He had been doing research, he said. The word research carrying the weight of time spent online discovering information he believed she didn't have. He had found an article about karst geology in the southern Appalachians. He had found reference to significant cave systems in Yancey County. He had connected these things to the land their grandfather had left, and the connection had produced in him a different quality of interest than he'd expressed before. The tone had changed. Concern had given way to something more urgent, more alert. The tone of a person who had glimpsed something valuable and was recalibrating his position with respect to it. If there's a cave system under that land, that changes the value significantly. Ecotourism, scientific research access, mineral rights depending on what's in it. You're not equipped to navigate that kind of complexity alone, Elena. You need someone with business experience handling this. I have an attorney, Howard Peel. He's a small-town probate lawyer. This needs real representation. Kyle at my firm has done natural resource transactions. It's my land, Carlos. It was left to you, yes. But family has a stake in this. Abuelo was our grandfather too. He may not have been thinking clearly about the broader implications. She had heard this argument before, in different language, from Marisol. The suggestion that Miguel's clarity had been compromised by age, by eccentricity, by whatever quality had made him leave his land to the granddaughter nobody was managing rather than to the one who managed things. She found the argument as unconvincing the second time as the first. Abuelo was thinking clearly, she said. He thought carefully about everything. He spent 50 years on that mountain thinking clearly. Elena. Carlos's voice shifted into its final register, the one that was past persuasion and adjacent to threat. I've already spoken to an attorney about the estate. There are grounds to challenge the bequest based on a diminished capacity argument. It would take time and it would be unpleasant, but if you're not willing to be reasonable about this, it's something we would consider. She had expected this. She had been waiting for it since the call about the geologist, which had been waiting to come since the call about the appraisal, which had been waiting since the letter from Peel. She had been watching it approach from a distance, the same way you watched weather approach over a mountain, reading its shape from miles away, preparing. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. When was the last time you called me before the inheritance? Not to give something, not to offer advice, just to call. To ask how I was, how Sofia was." The silence was long enough to be its own answer. "You were living in a storage unit," he said finally, "with your daughter. Did you think no one noticed? Did anyone help?" Another silence. "This conversation is getting emotional," Carlos said. "Yes, it is," Elena said, "because it's a conversation about whether family means anything besides inheritance. And I think Abuelo already answered that question when he left me the land, and not you. He knew what you would do with it." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hands for a moment, while the valley below went dark. Then she called Howard Peel and told him about the diminished capacity threat. Peel listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "I prepared for this. When your grandfather updated his will 2 years ago, he included a physician's certification of mental competency, signed by his doctor in Burnsville. He also provided a recorded statement, video, of him explaining his decision in detail and his reasons for it. He was very specific about his reasoning. He knew what was coming." "Of course he did," Elena said. "He was always watching." "He was," Peel agreed. The fracture finished its work on a Tuesday morning, 18 days after the first crack appeared. Elena was at the shelf when it happened, sitting cross-legged on the limestone with her coffee in both hands, waiting in the particular quality of patience she had developed on this mountain. Patience that was not passive, but attentive, the patience of someone who had learned to watch and was now being rewarded for watching. The sound this time was different from the grinding of the 12th day. It was a release, lower and more resonant, like a note played on an instrument so large you felt it more than heard it. The rock at the center of the fracture settled downward several inches, and the gap opened, widening smoothly, and the space that had been below the limestone shelf was now accessible from above. The opening was roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. Not large, but adequate, a rectangle of darkness with cool air rising from it, and from below, the smell of deep limestone, mineral and clean and ancient, and something else now that she was this close. A secondary smell she couldn't immediately identify. Something mineral, but sweeter, almost crystalline in its quality, like the smell of clear water, but richer, more complex. She had her climbing harness from the camping supply store in Burnsville, purchased 2 days ago with $40 of the $50 Peel had advanced her for contingencies, and the rope she'd bought the same day. She had a headlamp and 2 backup flashlights and Sofia's ruler for measuring. She had left Sofia at school. She had told Sofia the evening before that she was going to look at what was below the shelf while Sofia was in class, and Sofia had looked at her for a long moment with those serious dark eyes, and then said, "Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. You're going to tell me everything tonight." Everything. Sofia had nodded once, satisfied with this contract, and had gone to bed, and apparently slept without difficulty, because she was a child of great practical faith in her mother's competence, and because she had been waiting for this moment as long as Elena had, as long in some sense as they had both been waiting without knowing it. The whole arc of the past year, the storage unit and the letter, and the drive into the mountains, and the maps, and the spring, and the rain, and the crack widening over 18 days, all of it pointed at this morning, this rectangle of dark, this cold air rising from somewhere below. Elena descended on the rope. The first 5 feet were the narrowest, the walls of the fracture close on either side, and then the space opened, and she was hanging free. The rope above her, and the darkness below, and she turned on the headlamp and swung the beam around, and the first thing she saw was the scale of it. The cave was large. She had understood it was large from the tapping surveys and the floor she'd glimpsed with the flashlight. But understanding dimensions abstractly is different from hanging in a space and having your body register its size. The cave was at least 40 feet from floor to ceiling in the main chamber. It was, from this point of perspective, roughly the size of a large church, and it extended in both directions away from her into the dark, the headlamp's reach falling short of the walls on either side. She came down slowly, and her feet touched the cave floor, and she stood still for a moment, adapting, letting her eyes and her other senses organize the information coming in. The floor was limestone, worn smooth in the way of places water had moved through for a very long time, still slightly damp from the recent elevated water table. The mineral smell stronger here and richer. The cold steady and dry in the way of caves, which maintained a constant temperature regardless of what the air outside was doing. She turned slowly, sweeping the headlamp, and saw the cave extend to her left for approximately 30 feet before a bend obscured the far extent. And to her right, the main chamber opened into a space larger than the area she was standing in, a broadening of the void that the headlamp reached only partially. She went right. The cave widened as she walked, the ceiling rising, and the floor began to show formations. Stalagmites rising from the limestone in clusters, pale and glistening, some of them knee-high, some waist-high, some as tall as she was, columns of mineral deposit built drip by drip over periods of time she could not comfortably imagine. She moved among them carefully, the headlamp sweeping, registering their quantity, their size, the density of the formation field. Then she rounded a low natural barrier of stone, and she stopped. The chamber she had entered was large, possibly 60 feet across, possibly more, though the floor was covered in formations that in the headlamp's beam gave back light in a way the stalagmites outside had not, a different quality of reflection, brighter, more directional, as though the forms contained light rather than simply reflecting it. She moved the headlamp slowly, and the reflections moved with it, and what she was looking at resolved itself slowly into coherence. The formations were crystal, not calcite, not the ordinary white of cave formations. What stood before her in the headlamp's beam was selenite. She recognized it from Whitfield's briefing, from the research she'd done in the library, from the photographs she had studied in the geology books. But photographs had not prepared her for the scale or the character of what she was looking at. Selenite crystals in clusters and pillars and blades, some of them 6 inches across, some of them 18 inches, some of them 3 feet, catching her headlamp and fracturing it into 100 directions, the chamber alive with reflected light. The pale, warm color of the crystals shifted through cream and gold and an almost translucent white depending on the angle, and the sheer quantity of them. The floor dense with formation, the walls clustered to a height of 10 or 12 feet, filled the chamber with a quality that she would later struggle to describe in practical terms and eventually stop trying, saying only that it looked the way clarity felt, if clarity had a color and a texture and a scale that could fill a room. She stood very still for a long time. Then she took out her phone and photographed the chamber from every angle she could manage. And she measured what she could measure, and she touched one of the smaller crystals gently with her fingertip and felt the facets of it, sharp and precise and entirely real. And she sat down on the cave floor among the selenite formations and pressed her back against the cool limestone wall and allowed herself, in complete privacy, to understand what she was looking at. Her grandfather had stood here. She knew it without being able to prove it, the same way she knew other things about him from his letter and his maps, the knowledge arriving whole rather than being reasoned toward. He had found the way in during some earlier high-water period, some confluence of rain and elevation that had briefly opened a crack in the shelf, had descended as she had descended, had seen what she was now seeing, and he had climbed back out and gone home to his clearing and sat with the weight of it for 50 years, watching the shelf, watching the water table, waiting for the conditions that would open it permanently, that would allow someone to come down with the equipment and the professional support to do something real with what was here, waiting for the right person to inherit it. He had not been an eccentric old man who failed to think through the implications of his bequest. He had been the most patient person she had ever encountered, conducting across decades a single deliberate act of faith that one day the mountain would open and that the person standing at the bottom would be someone who deserved to be there. She climbed back out as the sun reached its midday position, the rope above her, the cool air of the cave following her up and dissipating into the September warmth as she emerged. She sat on the edge of the opening for a while, her legs dangling, looking at the valley below, where the ordinary world was conducting its ordinary business, not knowing what was 1,200 feet above it in the limestone ridge. Then she called Howard Peel. "You need to come up here," she said. "You need to bring someone who knows what they're looking at." I was right. Peel's voice was careful. How right? She looked at the opening in the shelf, the cool air still rising from it. She thought about the chamber full of selenite, the light in it, the ancient, patient beauty of what her grandfather had kept vigil over for 5 decades. "I think we need more than one kind of expert," she said. When Whitfield came back the following day with an economic geologist from Asheville University named Dr. James Okafor, a quiet man in his early 50s, with reading glasses and an unhurried manner, who spent 3 hours in the cave before he came up and sat with Elena in the clearing and organized his thoughts for another 20 minutes before speaking. "Selenite is a variety of gypsum," he said finally. "You know this already. What makes this formation economically significant, rather than simply geologically significant, is threefold. First, the size of individual crystals. What you have in that inner chamber includes crystals of a size that is genuinely rare. Collector-grade selenite of that dimension commands prices that are not comparable to bulk mineral material. Second, the clarity. The selenite in this system has a transparency and color quality I haven't seen in North American formations. It resembles, closely, material that comes from the Naka mine in Chihuahua, Mexico. Are you familiar?" "No," he showed her photographs on his phone. "The Cave of Crystals in Naka," he said. "One of the most extraordinary geological discoveries of the 20th century. Giant selenite crystals in a cave system, the largest reaching 11 meters. Your crystals are smaller, but the quality profile is similar. The transparency, the coloration, the surface geometry. Similar forming conditions." "How much?" she asked, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry, that's the wrong question." "No," he said, "it's exactly the right question." He took off his reading glasses and held them in both hands. "On the basis of what I've seen in the main chamber and the beginning of the secondary chamber, which I was not able to fully assess in one visit, the collector and scientific specimen market for selenite of this grade is substantial. Significant pieces can sell for tens of thousands of dollars each. Institutional buyers, museums, research collections. If the system extends, as I believe it does, based on what Carla has told me about the broader formation and what I observed of the secondary chamber, we are looking at a deposit that could sustain extraction of collector-grade material for many years. This is not a one-time sale. It is a sustained resource." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be precise with you," he continued, "because I've seen people receive imprecise estimates, and it causes problems later. I can't give you a number today. A complete assessment of the system would take several weeks of surveying. But I can tell you that comparable deposits, where they have been found and assessed, have been valued in the range of tens of millions of dollars at the low end, and considerably more, when the full system is characterized." Elena heard the number. She felt it land in her body somewhere between her sternum and her stomach, a physical impact, and she sat with it, while Okafor looked at his reading glasses, and Whitfield looked at the valley, and the mountain did what it always did, which was to hold still and keep its own counsel. She thought about Carlos calling her situation a problem. She thought about Marisol saying Sofia needed a real home, not an adventure. She thought about the storage unit in Asheville, where they had slept on a folding cot, while Gerald the mouse ran along the baseboards. She thought about her grandfather's letter and the phrase she kept returning to, the one about patient people and value and use being different things. She thought about the spring on the northwest face that never failed. Then she called Howard Peel and told him what Okafor had said. Peel listened without interruption, and when she finished, he said, "Your grandfather left another document with me. I was instructed to give it to you only if you found what I believe you found." He paused. "He also left a document addressed directly to your brother and sister, to be delivered in the event this moment arrived. What does theirs say?" He told me what was in it, in general terms. He addressed it to both of them. He said, "I watched you your entire lives. I saw how you treated your sister. I saw the money you took from your father's estate and the promises you made and didn't keep. I am writing this so that you understand that the decision to leave Elena this land was not made in confusion or diminished capacity. It was made with complete clarity, after decades of observation, because she is the one among you who still knows what family means. The mountain is hers. The decision is final. I hope you will someday understand what you lost, not the money, but the opportunity to be the kind of people who deserved it. Elena closed her eyes. He knew everything, she said. He prepared for everything, Peel said. There's also the video, recorded 2 years ago at my office. 22 minutes of your grandfather on camera explaining his decisions in complete detail. His cognition was, I can tell you from personal observation, entirely intact. Anyone challenging the bequest on diminished capacity grounds would be facing this video as evidence, and it is very persuasive evidence. Very clear-eyed. She was quiet for a moment. Howard, did he tell you what was in the cave? Another pause, longer this time. He told me he believed something significant was there. He said he'd seen evidence of it in 1987, when there had been a period of high rainfall, that the shelf had briefly partially opened, and he had seen the beginning of it. He said the system was too fragile to access safely then, and that the opening had closed again within days. He spent the next 36 years waiting for conditions that would open it permanently. He told me he was prepared to die without seeing it resolved, that he trusted the mountain to choose the right moment. She thought about her grandfather at 56 years old in 1987, briefly glimpsing the cave that lay below the shelf, and then watching the opening close again, knowing he might never see it open in his lifetime. Going home to his clearing, making his maps, writing his letters, waiting. Thank you, she said to Peel, for trusting him, and for trusting me. The full assessment took 3 weeks. Okafor returned with 2 colleagues, specialists in mineralogy and in the economics of decorative stone markets, and they spent 12 days in the cave system with equipment Elena helped carry down on the rope in multiple trips, on measuring and photographing and sampling. They found that the system extended beyond the main chamber into 2 secondary chambers, connected by natural passages, the total surveyed area eventually reaching 11,000 square feet, with additional passages suggesting further extent yet to be mapped. The inner chamber, the one Elena had entered first, was the most densely and dramatically crystallized. But the secondary chambers held their own formations, different in character, more varied, and one of them held something that stopped Okafor's colleague, the mineralogist, in her tracks on her second day in the system. She came up in the late afternoon with a look on her face that Elena was beginning to recognize as the look people had when this cave had just reorganized their understanding of their field. She sat on the shelf and looked at the valley for a while before she said anything. There's a section in the far chamber, she said, with formation quality that I don't have a direct commercial comparison for. The clarity is exceptional. The crystal geometry is exceptional. The size is exceptional. In terms of museum-quality scientific specimens, I've assessed a lot of cave systems. I haven't seen anything quite like this in North America. Elena waited. Individual pieces from that section, the mineralogist said carefully, placed at auction through the right channels, could reach prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for significant specimens. There's an institutional market, museums and universities, and research collections that competes aggressively for this quality of material. If the right curator or collector knew this existed, there would be competitive bidding. How many significant specimens does the far chamber hold? She looked at the valley, without damaging the formation? Which we wouldn't do, ethically, she calculated. 12 to 15 pieces that would qualify as major collection-grade material, dozens more that would sell at the secondary tier, and a sustained ongoing market for smaller specimens from the peripheral formations across all 3 chambers, material that can be extracted sustainably without compromising the primary formation. Elena did the arithmetic she had been avoiding doing because it felt like jinxing something, adding the numbers together carefully in her head. The major specimens, the secondary tier, the sustained peripheral market. The scientific access fees that Okafor had mentioned institutions would pay for ongoing research access to a system of this geological significance. She added them and let the total sit in her head for a moment. Then she said, "I need to call Howard Peel." Peel arrived the following morning with an assessor from a firm that specialized in mineral estates, a woman named Patricia Hines, who wore practical clothes and brought her own measuring equipment, and spent 2 days in the cave before she sat with Elena and Peel in the clearing with her assessment notebook and began to organize her findings. "The market for high-quality selenite specimens is strong and growing," she said. "There's been increasing institutional interest in the past decade as geological education programs expand and private collectors compete with museums for exceptional material." She flipped to a page in the notebook. "Based on the surveyed extent of this system, the quality profile of the crystals, and current market conditions, my assessment of the total sustainable yield value of this deposit is in the range of $40 to $65 million over a 20 to 30-year extraction period, assuming responsible and ethical practices that preserve the primary formation." She looked at Elena. "That's not a net number. There will be extraction costs, legal costs, market costs. But even accounting for those, you are looking at a generational asset. $40 to $65 million. Elena said it in her head once, then again. Not because she couldn't believe the number, but because she needed to feel its edges, to understand its shape. "There's something else," Hines continued. "Scientific access value." She turned to another page. "Geological research institutions pay significant annual fees for exclusive or priority access to cave systems of this significance. The University of North Carolina at Asheville and the NC State Geology Department have both indicated preliminary interest when Okafor mentioned the system to them informally. Those fees would be ongoing and would not reduce the mineral yield." "How much would those be?" Peel asked. "In the range of $50,000 to $100,000 per year, depending on negotiation." The three of them sat in the clearing on the mountain in the early October light, the first color beginning to show in the hardwoods on the lower slopes, the valley below going gold in the morning sun, and the mountain holding what it had always held, what her grandfather had watched over for 50 years, what had waited below the limestone shelf through drought and rain and the long patience of the old woman Earth, and had chosen this autumn, this woman, this story, to be its moment. Hines said, "Miss Vasquez, do you know how rare this is? Not the deposit itself, though that's genuinely extraordinary, but the fact that it's come to light through a private family transfer rather than being discovered during commercial development or government survey. When those routes are taken, the value goes to entities with legal structures already in place to capture it. You're in an unusual position." "I know." Hines looked at her carefully. "You've been here how long?" "About 3 weeks. And before that?" Elena looked at the valley. She thought about Gerald the mouse running along the baseboards. She thought about Sofia's drawings of houses with 3 figures holding hands in front of the door. Always 3 figures, always 2 standing together, and 1 small one beside them. She thought about the granola bar split in half on the dashboard in the Walmart parking lot, always giving her daughter the bigger piece. Always. "We were having a difficult time," she said simply. Hines nodded slowly. "The legal protections are solid," Peel interjected. "The deed is clean. The bequest is documented with complete competency evidence, and we have a recorded video statement from the testator that would make any challenge very difficult. Her siblings have made some noise." "What kind of noise?" "Preliminary. A diminished capacity inquiry to a Raleigh firm, which I am aware of. He paused. I've had the video certified and filed with the county. Any challenge would face it immediately. I don't believe they'll proceed when they understand the preparation your grandfather made. He was thorough. He spent 50 years being thorough, Elena said. The call from Carlos came 2 days after Hines filed her preliminary assessment with the county recorder, which was a matter of public record. He had clearly gotten wind of it. His voice, when she answered, had the quality of someone who had received news that reordered their understanding of a situation and was still deciding how to process it. Elena, I want to clear the air. She waited. I want to say that I've been handling this badly. His voice was careful in the way of someone who had been counseled on what to say and was staying close to the script. I was dismissive of your situation, and I was wrong about the land, and I think we should be talking about how to move forward as a family. She understood the structure of this. It was an opening position in a negotiation dressed as an apology. The sudden warmth after months of management and condescension, and the threat of legal challenge, timed to arrive precisely when a county record had indicated the land was worth considerably more than $18,000. She recognized it because she had watched it happen in real time in the cave assessment. The way people's voices and postures changed when the numbers became clear. The way interest arrived exactly when the value did, and not before. She thought about her grandfather's letter. Your siblings will come when they find out. They'll claim you're not capable. Stand firm. She thought about the recording Peel had described, her grandfather on camera for 22 minutes, explaining his decisions with complete lucidity. The man who had spent 50 years on a mountain learning to see things clearly. I appreciate that, Carlos, she said. I think we could be helpful to you. We have connections, business experience, people who could help you navigate something this complex. This is bigger than a small-town attorney can handle. Howard Peel has handled it extremely well. A pause. He's a probate lawyer, Elena. You're going to need real representation for what's coming. Mineral rights negotiations, extraction contracts, institutional agreements. That's specialized work. I'm already working with specialists. Another pause, this one with a slightly different texture. We're family, Elena. We should be in this together. She remembered him saying, "You were living in your car," when she had asked whether anyone had helped. She remembered the phone call where he had threatened a diminished capacity challenge. She remembered Marisol's careful tone. Sofia needs a real home, not an adventure. And the timing of that call, which had come after the geologist's truck was spotted on the county road. She thought about what she wanted to say, and what would be useful to say, and she decided they were the same thing. You threatened to have Abuelo's will contested, she said. 2 weeks ago. Now his land is worth a significant amount of money, and you want to be in this together. I noticed the order of those events, Carlos. His voice shifted to something colder underneath the warmth. You can't manage something this large alone. I'm not alone. I have an attorney, a geologist, a mineralogist, a market assessor, and a community of people in Yancey County who have been more genuinely helpful to me in the past month than my own family has been in the past year. She paused. I have a mountain. Abuelo left it to me because he watched us both for 40 years and decided I was the one who hadn't learned to take things from people. I think he was right. I think he's been right about most things. She hung up and stood on the wooden platform with the phone in her hands and looked at the valley below, where the October light was doing something extraordinary to the ridge lines, each layer a different shade of amber and gold and russet, more the old mountains, wearing their autumn colors, with the unhurried confidence of things that had been here since before anyone was watching and would be here long after everyone had stopped. Sofia came up the track from the county road at 3:30, her school bag over one shoulder, moving through the forest with the easy familiarity of a child who had come to know a place in her bones. She stopped at the limestone shelf on her way through, as she always did, and checked on the opening, and then came across the clearing to where Elena was sitting and dropped her bag and sat beside her without asking for an explanation of what had happened, because she had learned to read her mother's stillness and knew the difference between the stillnesses. "Something happened," she said. "The assessment came back today." "And?" Elena put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "And it turns out Abuelo was right. About the mountain. About what it was keeping." Sofia looked at the cave opening, the dark rectangle in the pale limestone shelf that they had watched appear over 18 days and had been descending into together for the past 3 weeks. Elena with the rope and the technical equipment. Sofia on supervised visits at the weekend with safety rules she observed with complete seriousness. "How much?" Sofia asked. Her voice had the directness she used when she decided the adult hesitation around a topic was not serving anyone. Elena looked at her daughter, this small, practical person who had ranked their experiences of homelessness with the calm of someone managing what was given, who had drawn houses compulsively for a year and a half, so who had named the storage unit Mouse and loved him without embarrassment, who had testified in the cave opening with the same attention she brought to everything, her small headlamp sweeping the crystal formations with a concentrated wonder that had nothing performative in it. "Enough," Elena said. More than enough. Sofia absorbed this for a long time. She looked at the cave opening, then at the valley, then at her mother. "He really did know," she said. "He really did." Sofia reached into her school bag and pulled out her notebook and a pencil, and sat for a moment considering the page, and then began to draw. Elena watched the drawing take shape, the mountain, the shelf, the dark rectangle of the opening. Below the drawing, in her careful printing, Sofia was writing a title. She wrote, "The Thing the Mountain Was Keeping." Below that, she added, which was ours all along. Elena pressed her face against her daughter's hair and closed her eyes and let the weight of the past year settle into its proper place in the past. No longer a judgment on what she was or wasn't capable of, but simply the distance she had traveled to get here. The distance that measured exactly how far a person had to go, sometimes before the thing that had been waiting for them came into view. The mountain held still around them, as it had held still for 50 years for one patient man, and for millions of years before that, for no one in particular, accumulating what it was accumulating in the dark below the limestone, building crystal by slow crystal, the gift that was waiting for someone worthy of it. The valley below was ordinary and beautiful and completely unaware of what had just happened above it. It would not stay unaware for long. The news broke on a Wednesday in late October. Elena had not intended for it to break at all. Not yet. Not before the legal protections were fully in place, and the extraction agreements were drafted, and the institutional access contracts were signed, and everything that needed to be organized was organized. She had been careful. Peel had been careful. Whitfield and Okafor had been careful. The assessment filings at the county recorder's office were a matter of public record, but they were dry technical documents that required some geological literacy to interpret, and she had believed, in the way of someone who has spent her life slightly underestimating how much attention other people pay to things that affect them financially, that they would go unnoticed for a while longer. She had not accounted for a reporter. His name was Daniel Fry, and he worked for the Asheville Citizen-Times, and he had been covering Yancey County environmental issues for 3 years, and had developed a habit of reading the county recorder's public filings, the way other people read the news, looking for the story underneath the bureaucratic language. He found the Vasquez mineral estate assessment on a Tuesday afternoon, recognized Okafor's name from a previous story about a geological survey near Burnsville, and called Okafor, who declined to comment, which told him he had something. He called Peel, who declined to comment more elaborately, which confirmed it. He drove up the county road the following morning and parked at the foot of the access track, just as the school bus was stopping. He was a polite man. She would give him that. He waited outside his car and introduced himself without pressure, and when she told him she wasn't ready to speak publicly, he nodded and gave her his card and said, "Whenever you are," and left. But the inquiry itself was the event. By that afternoon, the Citizen Times had run a brief item on their website. Mineral discovery reported on Yancey County Ridge property, and by the following morning, 2 television stations from Asheville had vans parked at the county road, and a wire service had picked up the item, and it had appeared in abbreviated form in newspapers in Charlotte and Raleigh. By the time Sofia came down the track for the school bus that Thursday morning, there were 7 vehicles at the county road. She walked past them without stopping, which Elena watched from halfway down the track, with her heart somewhere between pride and alarm. Sofia looked at the reporters the way she looked at everything unfamiliar, with attention, but without anxiety, making her assessment, filing it, moving on. She climbed onto the bus without a word to anyone, and the bus pulled away, and Elena stood at the gate at the foot of the access track and faced the cameras. She said 3 sentences. "The property belongs to me. The legal documentation is complete and on file. I have nothing further to say at this time." Then she went back up the track and called Peel. He had already spoken to a media attorney in Asheville that morning, on anticipating exactly this. The attorney's advice was direct. Say nothing detailed until the extraction and access agreements were signed, because negotiating positions were weakened by premature disclosure of asset value, and the asset value was now public knowledge in vague terms, but the specific numbers were not. Elena agreed to this. She was getting better at strategy, at the careful management of information and timing that she had never needed before, and was learning now with the same focused attention she had applied to everything since arriving on this mountain. What she was less prepared for was her siblings. Carlos arrived on a Friday, 6 days after the news broke. He did not call ahead. He drove up the access track in a rented luxury SUV that scraped its undercarriage on the creek ford and parked in the clearing with the confidence of someone who owned the place, which he did not. He had brought Marisol. He had also, Elena noted from the porch where she was sitting with her coffee, brought a man in an expensive coat who carried a briefcase. She walked out to meet them. Carlos had clearly prepared remarks. He began with the modified warmth he had used on the phone, the temperature adjusted to account for how much the stakes had risen, and moved quickly to a framing she recognized as having been drafted by the man with the briefcase. He said words like family partnership and shared legacy and equitable arrangement and responsible stewardship, and each phrase landed with the hollow precision of language that had been assembled to sound reasonable while meaning something else. The man with the briefcase was an attorney named Garner from a Charlotte firm that specialized in estate and mineral rights transactions. He was professional and smooth and said things about the complexity of mineral estate management and the advantages of experienced representation, and Elena listened to all of it without expression while the mountain stood at her back and the valley spread below in the October light. The hardwoods fully turned now, the ridgeline a conflagration of amber and red and gold against the blue sky. When they finished, she said, "Howard Peel is my attorney. All proposals should be directed to him." Then she said, "I'd like you to leave my property now." Carlos's prepared warmth faltered. "Elena, we came a long way. We're trying to have a conversation." "You've had 2 months to have a conversation," she said. "When I was in the storage unit, when I called asking for help after the divorce, when Sofia and I were sharing a granola bar in a parking lot. You didn't want to have a conversation then. You want to have one now because the county recorder's office published a number that interested you. Those are different conversations, and I'm only available for the first kind." Marisol said her name in the tone that preceded concern, the gentle approach that Carlos's directness had made room for. The two of them working in the pattern she had watched her whole life, the alternating pressure and sympathy that was designed to find the gap and widen it. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you. Something this significant needs people around you who understand how these things work. I have those people. Elena looked at her sister steadily. I have a very good attorney and a team of experts who understand exactly how this works. What I don't have is a reason to give a portion of something my grandfather specifically left to me, to the people he specifically chose not to leave it to. He made that decision very deliberately. He wrote a letter to both of you explaining why. Did you read it? Marisol looked away. He was thorough, Garner said carefully. We're aware of the documentation, but there are aspects of the legal situation that merit further discussion. Peel is available for that discussion by appointment, Elena said. You can reach him at his office in Slades Creek. She paused. I'm going to ask one more time, and then I'm going to call the Yancey County Sheriff's Department, which has been very helpful and has my grandfather's paperwork on file. Please leave my property. Carlos looked at her for a long moment. His face had the look of a person who had been practicing a version of this conversation in his head, in which she had been easier to manage than she was turning out to be. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, she said. This isn't one of them. They left. The SUV scraped the creek ford again on the way out. Elena stood in the clearing until the sound of the engine was gone, and then sat down on the wooden platform and let her hands shake for a minute, which they needed to do. She was not, she had discovered about herself since arriving on this mountain, or someone who operated without fear. She felt fear. The fear was real and present, and had been present through every confrontation with her siblings, and every descent into the cave, and every phone call where the numbers got larger and the stakes rose. What she had learned was that fear and capacity were not the same thing, that you could be afraid and still do the thing that needed doing, that the fear itself was not a verdict. Her grandfather had been afraid, she suspected, when he came to this mountain in 1971 at 40 years old and began building his solitary life. He had been afraid when he glimpsed the cave in 1987 and watched the opening close again before he could do anything with what he'd seen. He had been afraid that he would die before the conditions arrived, and he had died before the conditions arrived. And he had arranged things so carefully that it didn't matter. Fear had not been an obstacle for him. It had been a companion he had learned to work alongside. She picked up the phone and called Peel. They came, she said. I know. Garner called me an hour ago. Peel's voice was dry. He was considerably more deferential with me than I imagine he was with you. I sent them to you. You did correctly. He paused. They have no legal standing, Elena. Your grandfather's documentation is complete. The video is on file. The medical competency certification is on file. I have spoken to 2 probate specialists in Charlotte, who both reviewed the materials and said the same thing. There is no viable challenge here. Any litigation would be expensive for them and would fail. Then why are they still trying? Because the number is large enough that even a small chance seems worth the cost of trying. He was quiet for a moment. They will attempt one more approach. I expect it to be financial. An offer to drop any claims in exchange for a negotiated share. He paused. When that offer comes, you don't have to take it. But you have the right to consider it. It would make things quieter. Elena thought about her grandfather's letter. Stand firm. This is yours. Earned not by blood, but by being the kind of person who deserves it. I'll think about what quiet is worth, she said, and I'll call you when they make the offer. The offer came by certified mail 10 days later. Garner's firm, on behalf of Carlos and Marisol, proposed a settlement in which Elena would retain full legal ownership of the property and 70% of all proceeds from mineral extraction and institutional agreements, with Carlos and Marisol each receiving 15% in exchange for a signed release of all claims and a commitment to cease any legal challenge or public statements about the estate. Garner's cover letter framed this as generous, as a family solution, as the responsible conclusion to a situation that had the potential to become expensive and public for everyone involved. Elena read the letter 3 times. She thought about 15% of $40 million, which was $6 million, which was more money than Carlos had ever done anything to earn from her grandfather's mountain, or her grandfather's vision, or her grandfather's 50 years of patient guardianship. She thought about Sofia walking down the track at 7 in the morning to catch the school bus, her breath fogging in the October cold, doing it without complaint because that was who her daughter was. She thought about the storage unit in Asheville and the granola bar and the hospital application sent from a library parking lot. Then she thought about what her grandfather would have done. She called Peel. Counter it, she said. 0%. Full release. No negotiated share. If they want to challenge in court, they're welcome to spend their money doing it and explain to a judge why they waited until the land was worth $40 million to develop concerns about their grandfather's mental state. Peel was quiet for a moment. That's a harder line than I expected. He didn't leave them anything, she said. Not because he was confused or diminished or eccentric. Because he watched them their whole lives and understood who they were. For me to give them a share would be to undo his decision. I'm not going to undo his decision. All right, Peel said. I'll send the counter. Carlos called that evening, not with warmth this time and not with prepared remarks, just his own voice, stripped of the professional management he had been applying to his communications with her for weeks. And underneath the professional voice was something older and more complicated, the voice of a man who had grown up with her and understood at some level that what was happening here was not only about money. You really won't give an inch, he said. Abuelo didn't give an inch. He watched me for 40 years and left me everything and wrote a letter explaining why he didn't leave you anything. I think that was precise. I think it was meant exactly as written. He was silent for a long moment. Elena, his voice was different now, quieter. This is going to sound strange. She waited. When we were kids, when Dad was working all the time, and Mom was, holding everything together but barely, you were the one who made sure everyone ate. You were like 9 years old, and you were checking that everybody had eaten. He paused. I've been thinking about that lately. She didn't say anything. I think Abuelo saw that, he said, and I think I've spent a long time telling myself it didn't matter, the way you were, the things you did, because it was easier to think of you as the one who made bad decisions than to think about what it meant that you were sleeping in your car and none of us did anything. He exhaled slowly. I'm not asking for money. I'm telling you, I understand why he chose you. I think I understood it before I was willing to admit it. She sat with that for a long time before she said anything. Thank you for saying that. I'm going to tell Garner to drop it, he said. There's no case. There never was a case. We were afraid of the number. When the number is big enough, it does something to you. You start believing you deserve a piece of it just because it exists. Abuelo called that taking without earning, she said carefully, in his letter to you. Yeah, he paused. I read it. We both did. She stopped pursuing it after she read it too. She just didn't tell you that. He was quiet for a moment. He was very clear about what he thought of us. He was clear about what he thought of me too, Elena said. I'm trying to deserve it. Another long pause. I think you already do, Carlos said. He asked about Sofia before he hung up, genuinely, The way someone asks about a child they have failed to pay adequate attention to and are aware of it. She told him Sofia was thriving, that she had made 3 friends at the Yancey County School and had become something of a celebrity among her classmates for having a cave on her mountain. That she had begun keeping a meticulous scientific notebook documenting the cave's formations and the geological processes involved, informed by Okafor's explanations, which she had absorbed with a completeness that had impressed the university geologist considerably. After she hung up, she sat in the clearing for a long time. The October stars were out in full, the Milky Way visible as a pale smear across the dark, and the mountain was quiet around her in the way it was always quiet, a quiet that was not empty but full of the sounds of things living in the dark, the owl, the distant creek, the wind through the pine on the upper slopes. She felt the particular texture of something that had been weighing on her without her fully recognizing its weight beginning to lift. Not completely, not all at once, but beginning. She had been carrying the story of herself as a failure for 14 months. The divorce, the evictions, the car, the storage unit, the job applications that went nowhere, the siblings who didn't call. The story had a relentless internal logic that was hard to argue with when you were living inside it, when every circumstance seemed to confirm what the story said about your value and your judgment and your right to take up space in the world. She had resisted the story, but she had not fully escaped it. It had lived in the back of her mind like a second voice, providing commentary on everything she did. Her grandfather had seen something else, had watched her from wedding receptions and funeral halls and family gatherings, where he stood in the back of the room and paid attention, and had seen a different story. The one where she was the person who checked that everyone had eaten. The one where she was the one who gave without keeping score. The one where she was the person you trusted with your mountain when everything else was decided. She was beginning to believe his version. The extraction and institutional access agreements took 6 weeks to finalize, and they were among the most complicated documents Elena had ever signed, which was saying something given the past 2 months of legal activity. Patricia Hines negotiated the mineral estate terms with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was on the table and intended to maximize every element of it. Peel handled the legal review with the same deliberate care he had brought to everything since the beginning. Elena sat in the center of it all and asked questions and insisted on understanding what she was signing before she signed it, and learned more about mineral rights law and institutional access agreements and trust structures in 6 weeks than she had known in the previous 38 years of her life combined. The institutional access agreements were signed first. The University of North Carolina at Asheville and NC State's Geology Department entered a joint research access arrangement that provided for supervised scientific study of the cave system and contributed a combined annual fee of $90,000 to what Peel had structured as the Reyes Ridge Conservation Trust, the legal vehicle Elena had established to manage the property's income. The trust was structured to generate income for Elena and Sofia's living expenses and education, with a secondary allocation to conservation purposes, the maintenance and long-term protection of the formation itself, and a third allocation to a purpose Elena had specified herself and that Peel had spent a day trying to talk her out of and then stopped when he understood she was serious about it. The mineral extraction agreement was signed in the second week of November with an Asheville-based firm called Highland Mineral Arts that specialized in the ethical extraction and marketing of geological specimens for museum and collector markets. The terms were structured over a 25-year period with annual review, guaranteeing Elena a minimum of $800,000 per year from the specimen market alone, with escalating provisions tied to market performance and the quality of material extracted in any given year. In years when exceptional specimens were brought to market, which the firm estimated would occur 4 to 6 times in the first decade, The annual yield would significantly exceed the minimum. The morning after the final agreement was signed, Peel called her. "Everything is filed," he said. "The trust is active. The agreements are recorded. The institutional arrangements are in place. It's done." Elena was standing at the cave opening on the shelf when he called, the cool air rising from below, as it always did. The valley spread below in the November morning, the mountains bare now of their leaves, the ridgelines gray and clean against the pale sky, beautiful in their winter honesty. "It's done," she said. "Your grandfather would be pleased." Peel's voice had the quality of someone who had helped bring something to completion that had been in process for a long time. "He spent a long time getting this ready for you. I hope you know that." "I know," she said. "I feel it every time I'm up here." She told Sofia that evening, sitting on the wooden platform with hot chocolate from a thermos, the valley below, dark and scattered with lights. She told her in the direct way she had always tried to tell her daughter important things, without softening or simplification, because Sofia was a person who responded better to truth than to management. "The agreements are signed," she said. "The mountain is going to take care of us for a very long time." Sofia nodded slowly, processing. "How long?" "Long," Elena said. "Long enough that you won't have to worry about it when you're grown up. Long enough to take care of your children if you have them." Sofia looked at her hot chocolate. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was doing her internal accounting, adding things up, checking them against what she already understood. Then she said, "Can we build a house?" Elena laughed. The laugh came up from somewhere deep, warm and genuine, the kind of laugh that surprised you with how good it felt. "Yes, baby. We can build a house." Sofia smiled, the slow, careful smile that started at her eyes. "Can it have a window that looks at the cave?" "It can have whatever window you want." "Can Gerald come?" "Gerald the mouse has been living in the storage unit in Asheville for 2 months without us." Sofia considered this seriously. "I think Gerald is fine. He's a resourceful mouse. But I'd like to have a cat. I think that can be arranged." Sofia opened her notebook and began drawing immediately, with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for permission to draw the real version of a thing she had been sketching in approximation for 14 months. Not a generic house. This one. A specific house on a specific mountain, with a specific window, looking at a specific cave opening in a limestone shelf, mountains behind it and valley below, and the spring coming up cold and clear from the northwest face, permanent and tireless and faithful. She drew the figures in front of it. 2, as always, the tall one and the small one. She added a third figure, smaller than either of them, 4-legged. The cat she didn't have yet but had already decided on. She titled it, "The House We're Going to Build," and then below that, because Sofia always added the part that mattered most, she wrote, "Where we are from now on." The architect Peel recommended was a woman named Rosaria Mendez, who had grown up in western North Carolina and designed homes that worked with mountain topography rather than imposing on it. She came to the site in late November and walked the clearing and the shelf and the northwest face where the spring was and the lower portion of the track, and said nothing substantive for 2 hours, just walked and looked and listened in a way Elena recognized as the professional version of the attention she'd been paying to this mountain since she arrived. Then she sat on the wooden platform and said, "Your grandfather was right about where to put the clearing. The site has everything, so south-facing for passive solar, spring access, protected from the northwest wind by the ridgeline, clear view of the valley. He chose it well. He chose everything well," Elena said. The house Rosaria designed was modest in footprint and generous in its relationship to the land around it. It sat where the wooden platform had sat, facing south toward the valley, with a deep porch on the south side and large windows that caught the light from early morning until late afternoon. The materials were local: stone from the ridge for the foundation and fireplace, timber from sustainably harvested sources in the county for the frame. A guest room and a study, because Elena had decided that part of what the mountain gave her was the ability to do the work she wanted to do rather than the work she had to do. And that meant going back to nursing. And it meant having space for the kind of thinking that required quiet and time. Sofia's room had the window she'd asked for. It faced northwest and looked directly at the limestone shelf, the cave opening visible in the pale rock 100 yards up the slope, the air above it always slightly different from the air around it, slightly cooler, slightly more luminous, as though the cave were breathing. Construction began in March and finished in August, and on the last Saturday of August, Elena and Sofia carried in the first boxes, and Sofia put her stuffed rabbit on the windowsill of her new room and looked out at the cave opening and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "It's exactly right." The foundation they established that winter was Elena's idea from the beginning, though she didn't call it that at first. She called it a thing she was thinking about, and then a project, and then a plan. And eventually Peel told her he needed a name for the legal entity, and she thought about it for a week and named it the Miguel Reyes Foundation, because the proper acknowledgement of where things came from seemed more important than anything else she could think of to put on the letterhead. The foundation's purpose was specific and practical in the way Elena had decided most things that lasted needed to be. It provided legal, financial, and housing support to single mothers and their children in western North Carolina who were navigating the particular kind of crisis that Elena had navigated. The kind where everything cascaded and the floor kept dropping and the systems designed to help seemed designed for people in less complicated circumstances than yours. The kind where you ended up sleeping in a storage unit with your 9-year-old and a mouse named Gerald, while your siblings didn't call. She had not forgotten what that felt like. She did not intend to forget. She suspected her grandfather had not intended for her to forget, had suspected that the most useful thing his gift could do in the world was not simply to end her difficulty, but to make her difficulty useful to other people, to turn the particular knowledge of what it felt like to be at the bottom of a very deep hole into the practical capacity to help other people climb out. The foundation opened its intake office in Slades Creek in the spring of the following year. Peel helped structure its governance, pro bono, because he had told Elena at some point during the winter that working on this had been the most meaningful legal work of his career, and he intended to keep doing it as long as she'd have him. They hired a social worker named Alicia from Burnsville and a housing coordinator from Asheville who had done exactly this work for a nonprofit that had recently lost its funding, and they were open for business on a Monday morning in April, with 3 cases already waiting. The 4th case came in on a Wednesday afternoon, a woman from Ridgeton with 2 small children who had left a bad situation and had nowhere to go and had been referred by the women's shelter in Burnsville, which was now an active referral partnership with the foundation. Her name was Dora. She was 32 years old. She sat in the intake office and answered Alicia's questions with the specific combination of exhaustion and dignity that Elena recognized immediately because she had worn it herself, the bearing of someone who was at the end of their rope but had not yet let go. Elena was in the building doing paperwork when Alicia came to get her. She came and sat with Dora in the intake room, and they talked for an hour, not about the immediate logistics, which Alicia had already handled, but about what Dora wanted for her children, what she had wanted before circumstances had narrowed the field of the possible, what she was good at, and what she might become with support and time. When Dora left that afternoon with temporary housing arranged, and a follow-up meeting scheduled, and a list of the specific resources the foundation had identified for her situation, Elena stood in the doorway of the intake building and watched her walk to her car and felt something she would later try to describe to various people and never quite get right. It was not satisfaction, though satisfaction was in it. It was not pride, though pride was in it too. It was the feeling of a circle completing, of a story that had seemed to be only about suffering, revealing the additional meaning that suffering had been building toward all along. The meaning her grandfather had understood from the very beginning when he watched a 9-year-old girl make sure everyone in the family had eaten and decided that quality was worth protecting. But she had needed the mountain to open to find that meaning. The mountain had opened. The county newspaper ran a story about the foundation 6 months after it opened, not the story about the cave, which had been told and retold in various forms since October of the previous year, and had been picked up by national outlets twice and had generated a volume of media attention that Elena had managed with the help of the media attorney and had directed entirely away from Sofia. This was a different story, quieter, about what had been built with what the cave had given, about the women in Western North Carolina who had found support and resources and a way forward that they hadn't had access to before. Daniel Fry wrote it, the reporter who had been the first to call, the one whose polite patience at the foot of the access track she had respected, and she had agreed to speak to him specifically because he had been respectful and because she felt the Foundation's work deserved to be known. He asked her at the end of their interview what she wanted people to understand about her grandfather. She thought about it for a while before she answered. "He understood something I'm still learning," she said finally. "That value and use are different things. That worthless and overlooked are not the same thing." He looked at a steep mountain in Yancey County that the county valued at $18,000 and saw something different, not because he was naive or sentimental, but because he paid attention to things most people didn't bother with. He paid attention to the geology of the ridge. He paid attention to the people in his family. He understood what took time and what didn't, and he was willing to wait for the things that required it. She looked out the window of the intake office at the mountains in the November light. "I think he watched me most of my adult life and saw that I was going to need something to hold on to," she said. Not rescue. Something to hold on to. A fixed point. He gave me 67 acres and a limestone shelf above a valley and a spring that never fails. He gave me something permanent. And I think he knew that permanence was the thing I needed most, not the money, though the money changed everything. The permanence. The knowledge that something was mine and nobody could take it. Fry asked if she had a message for the people who had dismissed the land as worthless. She smiled slightly. "I don't have a message for them. My grandfather did. He left it in a letter he wrote, knowing exactly what they would say. He said, 'Value and use are different things.' He said patient people have always understood this better than impatient ones. He was right. He was right about most things." The story ran on a Sunday in November, almost exactly a year after the fracture had first appeared in the limestone shelf. It was read widely, shared more widely, and generated a phone call from a documentary filmmaker in Asheville, an inquiry from a museum in Raleigh that wanted to discuss partnership on a traveling exhibition about Appalachian geology, and a letter from a woman in Mitchell County who said she had land that had been in her family for 3 generations, and everyone told her it was worthless, and she had been afraid to push back, and the story had given her the courage to find out whether they were right. Elena replied to that letter personally, a long letter, handwritten on the notepaper she used for correspondence, and told the woman what Peel had told her about finding the right questions before you accepted the answers other people provided, and what Whitfield had told her about the difference between a property that appeared to have no value and a property whose value hadn't yet been revealed. She told her about her grandfather. She told her about patience. She told her about the spring. The following spring, like on a Saturday morning in March when the air was still cold, but carrying the particular quality of cold that preceded warmth, the quality that was the mountain's version of a promise. Elena and Sofia walked the property together from the access track to the summit and back. It was something they had started doing monthly since the house was built, a practice that had no official purpose except to walk the land together and know it and remember how they had come to be on it. The cave had been open for a year and a half now. The first Highland mineral arts extraction had taken place the previous October, 6 pieces brought up from the inner chamber with the careful deliberateness of the firm's ethical practice. Placed with a museum in Atlanta and 2 university collections and 3 private collectors whose credentials and intentions the firm had vetted rigorously. The return from those 6 pieces had been $480,000, which had settled into the Reyes Ridge Conservation Trust and been allocated according to the trust's guidelines, a portion to Elena and Sofia's living account, a portion to the foundation, a portion to the conservation reserve. More pieces remained in the cave. More would be extracted in coming years at the measured pace that protected the formation and sustained the resource. The cave was not being emptied. It was being, as her grandfather had intended, responsibly stewarded, yielding what it could yield without losing what it was. They reached the summit at mid-morning, under the highest point of the 67 acres, a bare limestone outcropping where the wind was always present and the view extended in every direction. To the south and west, layer after layer of ridge receded into blue distance, the old mountains wearing their age with the dignity of things that had survived everything. Time had thrown at them and intended to continue doing so. To the north, the valley of the Yancey River spread wide and familiar below, the town of Ridgeton visible in miniature, the river itself a silver thread, the ordinary world conducting its ordinary affairs without any particular awareness of the limestone ridge above it that had just changed 2 people's lives irrevocably. Sofia stood on the summit rock and looked in all 4 directions with the systematic attention she brought to things that required complete observation. "Do you think he stood here?" she asked. "Your great-great-grandfather?" Elena looked at the summit. "I think he stood here many times. What do you think he was thinking about?" Elena looked at the valley, at the mountains, at the pale winter sky above the bare ridge lines. "I think he was thinking about patience, about what you could understand if you stayed in one place long enough and paid attention, about what the mountain was keeping, and whether the right moment would come before he died." Sofia was quiet for a moment. "He didn't get to see it," she said. "No, he didn't." Elena put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "But he made it happen. He arranged all of it. The deed, the letter, so the maps, the video, the legal documents, 40 years of watching and planning, so that when the right moment came, it would land in the right hands. He didn't need to see it. He trusted it." Sofia leaned against her mother's side, looking at the valley. "I think about him a lot," she said. "Even though I never met him, even though he died before I was old enough to know him. He feels like part of us. He is part of us. He's the reason we're here. He's the reason the cave opened when it did, and we were the ones standing on the shelf when it did. He's in the spring that never fails, and the maps in the green box, and the crack in the limestone that took 18 days to open, and all the rest of it. He's everywhere on this mountain." Sofia nodded slowly. She opened her notebook, which she always carried, and drew the view from the summit. The layered ridges to the south, the valley to the north, the narrow finger of limestone that was their ridge pointing down toward the valley below. She drew it quickly, with the confident shorthand she had developed over a year and a half of drawing this mountain from every angle and in every season, and she labeled the features, Yancey River, Ridgeton, Reyes Ridge, the shelf, the spring. At the top of the page, she wrote the date. Below the drawing, she wrote, 1 year and 5 months since we came here. Below that, after a pause, she wrote, I think we were always supposed to end up here. I think Abuelo knew that too. Elena read it over her daughter's shoulder and pressed her face against Sofia's hair and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. They walked back down the ridge in the mid-morning light, the limestone pale and clean under their feet, the hardwoods beginning to show the first tentative green of the new season's leaves, the creek at the ford running high and clear with snowmelt from the upper elevations. The spring on the northwest face was audible from the track when they passed it, its quiet, persistent sound the same as it had always been, the same as it had been the first afternoon Elena found it and tasted the water and understood what her grandfather meant. Cold and clean and tireless, coming up from the limestone without hesitation, as it had been coming up before she arrived, and would continue coming up after she was gone, after Sofia was gone, after the cave had yielded its last specimen and the foundation had become something it couldn't yet be predicted to become, and the name Reyes had settled into the history of this county as permanently as the ridge itself. Springs that never fail are rarer than gold, her grandfather had written. She understood that now, more completely than she had the first time she read it. He had not been talking only about the water. He had been talking about the quality he had watched her for, the one she hadn't known she had until he named it. The quality of not giving up, the quality of staying when everything said he'd leave, the quality that had kept her in the storage unit one more day, and then another, and then the letter had come, and she had driven into the mountains on a 3-day-old tank of gas and signed her name on a deed to 67 acres of steep terrain that the county appraised at $18,000. That quality was the spring that never failed. The mountain had recognized it. Her grandfather had recognized it long before she recognized it in herself. And now, standing on her own land in the new March morning, with her daughter's hand in hers, and the old mountains patient and enormous around them, and the valley below going about its ordinary life, and the cave below the limestone shelf breathing its cool mineral breath in the dark, she recognized it too. She had arrived at this mountain with nothing. A car and a tent and a child and a letter from a dead man who had believed in her from a distance. She had stood on a limestone shelf above a valley and trusted something she couldn't yet see. She had waited. She had been afraid, and she had waited anyway. She had been patient in the way that patient people had to be, not the patience of resignation, but the patience of someone who knew the thing they were waiting for was real. The mountain had opened, and what came out of it was more than anyone standing on the outside looking in had known to predict, more than the mineral assessments and the market projections and the institutional agreements and the trust structures and the foundation accounts and the house with the window looking at the cave. More than all of that, what came out of it was the story. This story, from the one that now belonged to this ridge and to this family, and to every person who had ever stood at the bottom of circumstances that other people called worthless and chosen, against all advice, to believe they were not. Elena Vasquez had believed. The mountain had answered. And somewhere, in the careful letters of a man who had watched it all coming from the far side of a lifetime of patience, in a green metal box left in trust for the right moment, the grandfather she had barely known had said everything that needed to be said about how this was always going to end for someone who refused to give up on things that mattered. Springs that never fail, he had written, are rarer than gold. He had left her one. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.